Right, well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bruno Ramirez to Carleton University. He's Professor of History at the University of Montreal, and he is our second speaker in the Shannon Lecture Series, Performing History, Restaging the Past. He's widely published on the history of migrations to and within North America. His books in this field include Le Premier Italien de Montréal, L'origine de la Petite Italie du Québec, as well as On the Move, French, Canadian, and Italian Migrants to the North Atlantic Economy, 1861 to 1914, and Crossing the 49th Parallel, Emigration from Canada to the United States of America, 1900 to 1930. Bruno Ramirez has been actively engaged in filmmaking. He has co-written the screenplays for the award-winning films Café Italia, Montréal, and La Sarrasine, both directed by Paul Tana, and he has written the award-winning CBC miniseries Il Duce Canadese, directed by Giles Walker. In his most recent book, Inside the Historical Film, published by McGill Queen's University Press, 2014, he analyzes a variety of filmic representations of the past while also interacting with some world-renowned filmmakers who have directed historical films. So welcome to Carleton, Bruno. Yeah. So I'd like to begin by asking you about your work on Italian Canadians. It seems it's a very personal one. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like to do historical work on your own community, on your own history.
Yeah, actually the way I arrived at doing that kind of research was accidental, in that I got a job at the University of Montreal, so I moved from Toronto to Montreal. I realized there was a large Italian community. I knew that before, but very little research done on the history of that community. And so I thought that it was kind of a duty on my part, particularly because my field is not, at the time, was not immigration history, but U.S. history. And so I devoted quite a bit of time doing that kind of very basic initial groundwork on the origins of the settlement, Italian settlement in Montreal. And then from then on, I moved to a more detailed analysis. But I must say that in answer to your question, how does it feel? Of course, I have the advantage of being of Italian origin, of knowing the language, which helps me a lot in the research, in the interviews. I used a lot of oral history. We may talk about that later. But in a very important sense, although I'm not active within the community because my migration trajectory is different from that of most traditional immigrants who migrated in the post-war era as family groups or kin groups, etc. I've been doing that more as a sense of public service to a community that deserves having whatever I can offer as their own history, and particularly keeping in mind the second generation of that community. In other words, the children of these immigrants who either arrived very young in Canada or were born there, and they grew up within an Italian family, within an Italian community, without really knowing where that community came from. So that has given me a lot of personal gratification, and I've done that not so much strictly as a scholar, but also as a community worker, if I can use that term.
So how did you come to begin writing history in film?
It was very coincidental. In many ways, I was invited in the realm of filmmaking by filmmakers, either because they thought that I could offer some advice or some suggestions or on topics that required some expertise and so on. In fact, that was the original, even before I started working in Café Italia, which was the first major production. Several directors had already involved me in the capacity of either expert or advisor, etc. And then when it became a more regular, I could say career almost, parallel to my teaching, it was largely because of what I'd been writing, which interested directors, producers, and so they involved me in the work of conceiving a film, and which was a very rare opportunity because usually experts are kept at a distance. You know, they are listened to, and then of course they are paid and goodbye. Whereas in this case, because it was an independent filmmaking context, and the director Paul Tana soon we became mutual friends. So he really wanted me to participate fully in the conception and in the writing of some of the dramatized section of Caffè Italia. And so that led us to further projects, one after the other. In fact, we did 3 like that. And in the process, I learned the techniques of screenwriting, which very much is a technique, you know. And that's the way it happened. So I didn't go to screenwriting schools, or it just happened. I had 2 trajectories that crossed each other, and then they became one project after the other.
Well, I wonder if you could share with us some of the challenges, I guess, you faced as a historian. I guess I'm thinking of tensions between, I don't know, being faithful to a knowable past and the demands of the film medium, or to put it another way, the tension between fact and fiction.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I deal with that quite a bit in my book in ways maybe different from your question, but essentially in the same direction. I think that I learned very, very fast, very quickly, that working for a feature production where fiction is the mode of narration, that at some point in the process of research and then screenwriting, I had to forget that I was a historian. And I had to really change my frame of mind in terms of creative writing, according to the needs of the medium, as you said. So in that sense, in each case, because all the films I've worked on, they have an historical background, historical basis, which require research, the kind of research that most historians have to do. But of course, all of that research then had to be redirected in terms of characters, in terms of dramaturgical exigencies, effects, locations, and things like that. And so all of that is part of a creative process where you, as I said at the outset, you have to forget about the notion of exactitude, of sequence of events, of causality, and you have to recompose that knowledge to serve the needs of dramaturgy, essentially. So I think that once I understood that, and as I said before, I understood it very quickly because I had the great advantage of working with the same director who then would shoot the film, direct the film. So this co-writing, this process of co-writing was extremely important for me as a learning experience. And as a historian, I also learned that. So that's the way I kind of controlled whatever potential tension there could have existed, yeah.
Well, that leads nicely to my next question, which is, I just wondered if being involved in making history on film, did that change your views at all about the historian's craft, about what we do, how we do it, what we think we're doing when we write it in more traditional ways, as in books and articles and so on?
Yeah, that's a very basic question that you raise. Definitely, I learned writing translating historical knowledge into filmic narrative taught me certain things, although I've never written about it as such. But and I think the most important, I think the historical craft that I continue to practice within the academia context has remained the same. I've kept participating to various thought movement in history, whether it's interdisciplinarity, whether it's transnationalism or a perspective, etc., etc. So that I still believe in the historical craft, in the craft of the historian, of the professional historian. But I think that a lot of what I taught was more in how to communicate that knowledge as a story in the written format. Of course, I'm not talking about filmic narration here. And I think what I learned is that we historians, of course, depends very much on the topic we are working on, but we have possibilities that sometimes we miss of injecting drama in our narratives. It's obvious that any piece of historical academic writing has to be submitted to certain rules, parameters, which of course are tested by peer reviewers, etc. And so but also written historical narration, of course, is based to a large extent on causality. It's argumentative, etc., etc. But as I was saying before, there is room for injecting drama, and I learned that I'd learned that already by reading some books, historical books that had really fascinated me for using these opportunities, and then I became even more aware of those possibilities and trying to find them, trying to look for them and injecting them when I could. And so that's what I've been doing. When I say injecting drama, that doesn't necessarily mean, writing a script within an article or a chapter, but structuring the narrative in ways that the dimension of drama can be emphasized, when in fact normally would be left out, etc. So I think that would be probably the main thing I learned. But of course I keep practicing the craft of historian and participate to its evolution within my own profession as a historian, yeah.
So given your writing and your filmmaking and your wonderful book, in which the second part are these extraordinary interviews with some of the most influential directors of historical feature films, I just wonder if you could finish the interview by reflecting a little bit about your take on the relationship between history on the one hand and performance on the other.
Yeah, first of all, I should say that I am a latecomer to the whole performance development of studies, which when I discovered it fascinated me. At the first level, because of its interdisciplinarity, which is a real one. It's not a matter of symmetry between 2, 3, 4 disciplines that try to get together and compromise, but it's integral in the whole procedure and the whole conception. The other thing that fascinated me was, as a practitioner of oral history myself, in some of my books I'd used oral history as a necessity at the time, as a source that I could not do without. And then I discovered, reading performance work, that there was much more behind an oral interview than just transmission, communication of events and anecdotes and facts, etc. So those things, but I think the idea of, which from my understanding is central to performance studies and practice, the idea of making the past alive through not an impromptu performance, but something that involves a certain degree of creativity, because one has to, there is a minimum of dramaturgy involved, and all of that with very few technical means, essentially. So it's really much closer to theater than, let's say, filmmaking, which is highly technical, etc. So in many ways, I think the relationship, I would say that it's too bad that this relationship has been discovered so late in our historical profession. But I think it is catching up very quickly, and I really hope that many of my colleagues, our colleagues, will become sensitized to this possibility. And what really struck me that at first I thought that performance history could be done only by working on oral history material. And so my question was, well, what about modern history? And then I gradually, partly thanks to your work and others, I discovered that it can be applied even to ancient history. And so in that sense, it's an open field, and an open field that deserves to be really exploited and inject a lot of creativity within our profession. Thank you.
Well, Bruno, thanks very much for sharing your insights with us today.
My pleasure.